Hello, everyone. This is the Atlanta FileMaker Developers Group. Today is Wednesday, August 4th, 2021. My name is David Naadel from Blue Feather, and today we have Steve Winter, who is going to be presenting to the group on using Ansible to deploy FileMaker Server on Linux. Steve, thanks for coming to present today, and take it away.
Okay, well, as we've just heard, this session's about installing FileMaker Server on Ubuntu using Ansible. Whoa, that didn't work. Let's try that again. Yeah. Okay, that's not going to let me share my slides in here.
Looks like that was on the last slide on your list.
Maybe I should go back to the beginning. Good call. That'll work. Okay. So I think most people, at least online right now, know who I am. I used to be a school teacher, a science educator. I've been doing FileMaker stuff since well before I had grey hair. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of that these days. A lot of the work that we do is all around FileMaker integration, particularly web application development, which has been sort of the mainstay of our business for a number of years now. I'm a freelancer, and I run Multi-Terra Solutions, which is, as the logo says, a FileMaker web development company. When I'm not working, I like traveling, or at least I used to like traveling before the COVID times. My most adventurous trip was from Beijing to Istanbul in Turkey, which is about 8,500 miles. And because that wasn't hard enough, I did it all on a bicycle. A bit later on, I also did the same thing around the west coast of Africa. These days, I live in a place called Christchurch in New Zealand, which for many of you is the other side of the world, and it's already tomorrow where I am. In this session is all about installing FileMaker Server with Ansible. So we'll take a look at what Ansible is. I'll do a bit of a demo. We'll take a look at the scripts that Ansible is using to perform that demo, and then we'll have a quick chat about what else we can do, and there'll be time for questions and answers at the end. Although, with only a few of us here, if you have got questions or you're kind of a bit confused about what I'm talking about, just feel free to stop me anywhere along the way. So what is Ansible? According to the Ansible website, Ansible is simple IT automation, which sounds grand, but it doesn't really tell us very much. Wikipedia says that it's an open source software provisioning, configuration management, and application deployment tool for enabling infrastructure as code. So the idea of infrastructure as code is that you don't want to be manually configuring servers, because there are inherent risks with that things won't be done the same way every time, and that you can end up with different servers configured in different ways. And so by using code to manage that infrastructure, you can help avoid those sorts of problems. So what is Ansible? It's written in Python, which is a quite common programming language for things like infrastructure as code, because it's a very utilitarian language. It's very good for interacting with the servers and the real world as well, with a lot of libraries that make it very, very easy to integrate with different applications. It uses something called YAML, which literally stands for yet another markup language. And it uses YAML to create things called inventories and roles and templates. And then you combine all of those things together into something called a playbook. The idea with a playbook is that it performs the tasks in the role on remote servers that are specified in the inventory. So basically, it's a way that you can take all of these things, join them together, and result in changes being made on a usually remote server. And that might be remote in the next room, it might be remote in that it's a virtual machine, or it might be remote that it's a cloud server somewhere a very long way from you. Ansible can only manage servers that it knows about. So as part of the setup for Ansible, you need to tell it which server or servers it's going to be acting upon. It's completely agentless. And that's one of the advantages that Ansible has over some of its competing applications. Things like Chef and Puppet generally require that you install an agent on the server, whereas Ansible is completely agentless, and basically everything's undertaken via SSH. So other than ensuring that the Python language is installed on the remote server, you don't need to do anything further. And this is kind of what I was alluding to before. It's completely independent, which basically means you will get the same result every time you run it and without side effects. And you can do that on one server multiple times, or you can do the same thing on multiple servers, either sequentially or either it's applying multiple steps to the same server, or applying to, no, I'm not explaining that well. you can basically, because the playbook is made up of a series of tasks, you can either perform one task on many machines and then move on and perform the next task on those same machines, or you can perform all of the tasks on one machine, then move on and perform all of the tasks again on a second machine. And it's declarative. You define the desired state of the machine in steps, which will ultimately get you to the desired state. Okay, I hope that sort of made sense, but probably the best thing to do to help it really make sense is to actually show you a bit about how it works. And I'm going to attempt a live demo, which is always going to cause interesting times. First of all, I'm going to switch over to my browser and go to the control panel. This is the control panel for OVH, which is a cloud provider. I'm just going to use that to create a brand new instance because I wanted to show you, really prove there was no smoke and mirrors here. So I'm going to start off with creating a new instance of an Ubuntu server that we can use to install FileMaker Server onto. For the purposes of this, I'm just going to choose a really cheap little server, 2 gig of RAM, 1 virtual core, 10 gig of space. Just to help me out, I'm going to use the Sydney data center. It'll just make things a little bit quicker. Now, this process that I'm performing now, I'm doing through the web UI. I could, of course, use Ansible to interact with the API of my cloud provider if I wanted to. But part of the thing about only acting on servers that are known is that we just need to make sure that the server we wish to install FileMaker Server onto, we know what its IP address is. There are ways that we can chain together playbooks so that we could use one playbook to create the server and then a second playbook to actually do the provisioning. But for now, I'm just going to keep this simple and we'll do a manual setup here. Next, and because this is only going to run for a couple of hours, I'll just create my hourly billing. So basically what's happening now is a Ubuntu 18.04 server is being spun up in a data center just across the Tasman for me so that we can run this demo through. Just need to wait for that to complete, which it's doing now. Just jump into the instance details because I need the IP address of that server. Okay, so I'm just going to copy that IP address and I'm going to do two things with it. One, I'm going to jump over to here and that's going to be a nuisance. I need to add the DNS entry for that machine. And this has decided that it needs okay, all right. Let's leave that doing that. Let's jump back over here. So this is one of the Ansible files. This is the SSH
Can you zoom in on that a little bit or make the text larger?
can I zoom in on that?
There, thanks. Perfect. Great. Thank you.
And so in here, I'm just setting up a mapping between the domain name and the host name, the IP address. In here, I configure that the user that I'm going to connect to the server with is called Ubuntu, and that the key that I'm going to use to connect is called MSD shared. For those of you who aren't so familiar with Linux as an operating system, one of the key ways that you can connect and provide authentication is to use public and private keys. So you may have seen when I was configuring that server that I chose the MSD shared public key, and here I'm just saying that I want to connect as the user Ubuntu with the private key, which is here on my local machine. Let's just jump back over here and keep this thing moving along. So this is basically just a mapping. It's similar to DNS, and if I can get DNS working, that will really help as well. This was all connected and open before. Okay. Just going to jump in here and a new host, which I'm going to call FMPA, and just pop that IP address in there as well. Okay, the advantage of that is that you'll be able to see that server operational once we've finished here. So at this point, that's just a basic server. There's nothing installed on there whatsoever at all. Now, Ansible is a purely command line tool. And so everything that we do is done through the command line. I am running this command called Ansible Playbook, which says, hey, run this playbook. Which playbook do I want you to run? I want you to run the one that's called site.yaml. I want you to use the inventory file called OVH, and that's just a file that I've set up that points there. And then I just want to limit this so that we'll only run on fmpa.msdev.nz. But this limit is quite useful because it allows me to say I only want to interact with this server, or I could put a list of multiple servers here that I want to perform this actions against, or I could just leave the limit off, at which point it would go ahead and it would configure all of the servers that are defined. So if I look in here, this is the site.yaml, this is the playbook. It's saying that we're going to talk to the FileMaker server hosts. We're going to do some tasks before we get started, which involves installing Ansible, installing Python. So it just checks to make sure that we've got Python installed on their own remote machine. And if it's not there, it will install it for us. And then it's going to go ahead and run this role called FMS. The last thing it's saying here is become true. And that means basically that we're going to run as the sudo user, so the root user. Although we're logging in as the Ubuntu user, the become true says that we're going to elevate our permissions so that we are performing all of these tasks as if we were the root user. If we just have a quick look, I said I was using the OVH Inventory. And in here, I just need to update this to say that the FMA server that I just set up is a FileMaker server, and that it is in the OVH group. So this is just kind of joining together some of the concepts that is described here. The roles, the hosts that we'll act upon are those which are FMS, and the role that we will perform is FMS. And so this inventory is just joining those two things together. It's saying that these servers are FileMaker servers, and it's saying also that they are also in the OVH group. So if I hop back over to Ansible here to my command line, and I hit go, I'm kind of going to find that.
I think you have FMPA instead of,
yeah.
I don't know if that.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Let's try that again. Wow, this is kind of handy and not. Okay, so this is debugging on the fly, a playbook that worked really well. Line 95, column 3. Okay, that's because I was trying to be clever in here.
If you can make the text larger and all of these things when you're trying to show them, that'll help us view this as well too.
Yeah, can do. I'll just make sure this is going to run now that I've. Okay. Okay, so clearly I'm not lining things up here. I made that one FMPA. Okay, you tried to tell me that, didn't you, Michael? You tried to tell me that I was doing things differently, and I thought I knew where I was doing them wrong. Just make sure I've got all of these all done the same.
Can you zoom in on all those files as you're pulling them up too?
Yeah.
I can't read it clearly. Terminal as well would be nice.
Yeah. Okay. Just make sure this is going to start running. Okay. It seems to be as far as terminal is going to let me zoom in here, unless someone knows. All right, there we go. Okay, right, after a few hiccups with changes I was making. So basically what's happening now is that we've connected to that server. We've told it that we want to connect. It's a new server. We are running the setup, which just made sure that Python was installed. And now we're on to the next step, which is making sure that the server's up to date. So this is basically just performing updates on that base server. Certainly with many cloud providers, when a server is first provisioned, there will often be updates that are needed because they'll be looking at their base image will be somewhat out of date. I'm just going to leave that running. I'm actually going to move it off onto a different screen so I can keep an eye on it while we take a look at what's actually happening. So if I zoom in on here. And we'll just maybe pop this back a little bit. So basically, as I said, the first thing we're doing is making sure that the server's up to date. So we're using apt, which is the tool that's used on Ubuntu servers to install applications. And we're basically just saying that what we want to do is perform an upgrade. And that just ensures that everything is completely up to date. The next thing that we need to do is that we need a Python library. And Python uses a tool called pip, which is used to install other libraries. So the first thing that we need to do is we actually need to install the Python library installer. I said before that we don't need an agent in order to run Ansible, but there are some instances where we do actually need some special libraries, but they are generally just Python libraries. So pip is used for installing Python libraries. Again, you can see that we're using apt here. We're saying use apt to install Python 3 pip at latest. As soon as we've done the installation of that, we then actually use pip to install a library called pexpect. Now, we need pexpect because, as many of you would be aware, the FileMaker Server admin command line tool often asks questions. And so we need to be able to answer those questions in an automated way. And pexpect is a Python library that lets us do that. The next thing that we do in here is we create a folder for the installer. I'm just putting in the temp directory for now. And then we copy the installer onto the host. Now, at present, this is copying it. It's copying from the files path, the installer, and it's taking it across onto temp, FMS, and then the installer file name. A little hard to see up here in the left-hand corner. You can see that within this role, I have files and I have the installer in here. It's using here a variable called installer file name, and that is coming from one of our variables files. In this variables file, I'm defining yet another domain name, which is a bit annoying, but it shouldn't matter. I'm defining the administrator user and password and an admin pin, which will be used when we're configuring the server. I'm saying which is the current version of the installer that I'm using is, and then I've also got in here, I've got an SSL certificate, but further down I've got the intermediary certificate, and further down still I've got my SSL key. And that basically allows this process to install those as we go through. So right now we're copying the installer over. The next thing we need is the license certificate. So basically this is my FileMaker Server license, which we'll need for the installation. So that gets copied across as well. And then we are going to copy it and populate the assisted install file. Now, you can see here that in my Ansible script, I'm saying that this is a template. And I'm saying the source is assisted install, and I want to save it to this assisted install location. If we take a look at that assisted install, you'll see that it looks just like, it's simply an assisted install as you would use for installing FileMaker Server. But in here, I've got these double braces and then some variable names. And so basically what this is doing is that it is pulling in these variable names from my variables file. So it's pulling in admin user, password, and admin pin, and it's inserting those into the appropriate locations. It says where the certificate path is, which is where I've just uploaded it to. So basically this step is kind of doing two things at once. It's populating the template and also copying it onto the remote server so that we have the assisted install file ready to use. Let's jump back over here. Right, so if we see where we're up to. So the process is copied and populated the assisted install file, and it's now running the FileMaker Server installer. So again, the apt command is quite flexible. We can, earlier on, we were just saying apt install something, whereas here we can use apt and we can say exactly what is it that we want to install, and we can point the apt at that install file that we uploaded. So we can say apt install this thing here, and the apt command will do that. The other thing that we're doing here is that we're setting an environment variable. The FileMaker Server installer needs to know where to find that insisted install text file that we uploaded. And we do that by setting this environment variable. This is simply defined in the documentation for the Linux installer. And we just say, where is the file? It's in /temp/fms. So it will continue on doing that. It takes a little while for that to happen, although it has finished. That's great. Next thing we need to do is we need to get the SSL certificate there. So we are copying using the Ansible copy command, and we're taking the variable SSL certificate, which is over here in my variables file. We're taking that and we are saving that into this path, etc SSL certs, the domain name, and then the cert. It's owned by root, and it has very restrictive permissions, so only the root user can read it. We do the same thing with the SSL key. We do the same thing with the intermediary certificate. So we've now got those 3 files on the server. Next off, we, as it says here, use the FMS admin to import that SSL certificate. So this is where that expect module I was telling you about before comes in hand. So the command that we want to run is FMS admin certificate import. We say where the certificate is, where the key file is, where the intermediary certificate is. So that's just a standard FMS admin command, which will perform that certificate import. Now, because FileMaker Server asks a bunch of questions as it goes along, and so that expect library is able to deal with those questions. So the first question that gets asked by FileMaker Server is that, and we want to answer yes. The next one is it asks for the username, and so we give it the admin user. It asks for the password, so we give it the admin password. And so basically that has now imported the SSL certificate directly into the FileMaker Server. Next up, we do a little bit of tidying up, remove the installation directory. So we just say this file path should be absent, and we take that away. This next step is a slightly odd one. There is a file called .exfact.json, which lives in this location on Ubuntu server. That file needs to exist, otherwise FileMaker Server admin console will still think that you haven't installed the SSL certificate. So basically what we do is we just take a file and we put in there what it expects to find. And it expects to find a UUID in there, 32-character UUID as an X key. So basically we say, let's build this file, let's put it where FileMaker Server expects it to be, make sure it's owned by the right user and group, and in that way, FileMaker Server will know that it's got an SSL certificate installed. Then the last step that we need to perform is just a reboot to restart the server to apply the permissions and the imported certificate. So if we hop over here, back to the console, you'll see that we've got all the way to the end, but it's done that and that it's changed 14 OK for 17, which basically means that that whole process has worked. Which means that if I take this domain name and I grab myself a browser window and hope that I have got my DNS right, you can now see that we get fmpa.msdev.nz shows up as a FileMaker database server. It has a valid SSL certificate installed, which just happens to be a wildcard certificate for the domain name, which makes things nice and simple. If we go to 16,000, we'll get the admin console. We can log in there with my super secret password, which I think was password, but I can't remember. Now I tried to make it a little bit more secret. I log, sign in there. Then you can see that basically we've now got fully operational FileMaker Server. It has a valid license installed. It has a valid SSL certificate installed. It has the FileMaker Server database connected already there and open and basically ready to go. And if I hadn't had some typos in my playbook at the beginning, basically I would have had to do very little more than run that one Ansible command to install everything that we need on that FileMaker Server. If we just jump over here and grab a copy of FileMaker Pro, just to prove that that works as well. And we'll just add a new host in here. Not for that. fmpa.msdev.nz. Goodness. typing is clearly not my forte today. And there is that sample file. Thanks, FileMaker. There is that sample file open. If we jump back over here, we can now see that Steve Winter has arrived as a guest from my IP address. Okay. The right thing. So basically, that's the demo. That's using Ansible to start from absolutely nothing and end up with a fully operational FileMaker server in a little under 20 minutes, which didn't even need to be that long. A lot of that was me just talking. Okay, so what else can we do using Ansible? We can interact with files using the FileMaker Data API. I have a setup where I use Ansible to retrieve the current running version of a file from a client server and move it onto a local server. So basically, the Ansible Playbook can connect to the server. It can use the FileMaker Data API to retrieve information about the current state of the database. It's pulling in some data fields that are in there to know what's been changed in the file, and then make decisions accordingly. We can install out other applications that we need. For example, Dropbox or pretty much anything else that we might need. One of the things with using Ubuntu as a FileMaker server that a lot of people ask about is well, how do you deal with backups? And one of the ways that I often deal with backups is by using Dropbox, where there are scripts that run after the backups have run to compress them and then move them into a Dropbox folder to be synced off server. And we can use Ansible to install Dropbox as well. We can install other scripts. We can install shell scripts. We can install plugins into the right folder. We can copy FileMaker files onto the server. The example I was mentioning before, where I'm connecting to a remote FileMaker server with the Data API, once I know what I need to do, I can then, in the playbook, we close some files on the remote server. We copy those across to another server. We reopen them on the new server. We shut the versions that are there and open them there. And it's just a way that we're using for moving data around, moving data files and interface files around. And as I've said, FMS Admin, we can modify server configuration. We can open, close, remove files as we need to. In that command, in that demo, the only time I was using FMS Admin was to import the SSL certificate. But anything that can be done with FMS Admin can be done using Ansible. And we can configure multiple servers simultaneously. As I was saying, it may be that we do one server through the entire process and then move on and do a second server through the entire process. Or it might be that we are dealing with multiple servers all at the same time, and we do step 1 across servers 1, 2, 3, step 2 across servers 1, 2, 3, and so on. So it can be a very quick and easy way to perform updates across servers, for example. And the other thing that we can do is we can use it to automate the use of the data migration tool. Some of you might be familiar with the Geist interactive tool Otto, which is kind of an abstraction layer on top of the data migration tool. And you could quite easily use Ansible to perform that same type of task, where it's uploading a file, closing a file, running the data migration tool, and then reopening the file on the FileMaker server again. Questions is there. I'm just going to skip forward to the next slide and jump out of there. These are some resources that might be useful. The Ansible website, first of all, a description of how Ansible works, which goes into a lot more detail than I've done here. The playbook that I've used in the demo is available. It's in GitHub. You're welcome to fork that, do as you wish with it. And then there's also a blog post that I wrote some time back about connecting to the FileMaker Data API using Ansible as well, which may be of interest to people. And that is as much as I have at this time. So if people have questions or want me to run through something again, then I'm more than happy to do so.
That was great, Steve, and it's good to see you after all this time. I got a couple quick things. I noticed there was some file extensions .j2. Is that just an Ansible thing, or is it something else?
Yep. So
Okay.
J2, it's not an Ansible thing specifically. It's a Python thing.
It's a Python thing. Okay.
Yeah. So J2 means that is a Jinja, Jinja file, and that is a a templating language that's used a lot in Python. It's used by Ansible, but it's also used by Django and the other like web frameworks and so on that are Python based. Often use the Jinja templating language.
Okay. I was pretty happy with that FileMaker came out with FileMaker Server for Linux on Ubuntu, and I think they just had a newer version than 19.3.1. But
yes,
I know they came out with a data migration tool now for Linux, which is awesome. I sort of read that it's not ready for prime time yet. Have you had any experience with running it either through Ansible or otherwise?
I have. The problems that I am aware of all tended to be around the fact that if you try to run it standalone, it doesn't install all of its dependencies. And so it tends to appear not to work because it doesn't install everything. If you install it on a server that already has FileMaker Server on it, it runs absolutely fine. It's just if you try and install it without FileMaker Server, it gets a bit hung up. Wim DeCourt has a blog post or a community post that explains how to get around that.
Okay.
As far as I'm aware, and certainly with my experience of it, it is running exactly the same as anywhere else.
Good to hear. Thank you. It seems like this tool would really shine when you're managing, a lot of servers, maybe for a lot of clients or for other reasons. Is that part of what you all do? Do you have so many that you can't? It seems like if you are managing a lot of servers, this seems like an easy kind of a slam dunk thing to do.
Yeah, we don't manage a lot of servers for a lot of people, or not a lot of FileMaker servers, but we do manage a lot of web servers, and we use Ansible for all of that, for managing web servers, web application servers. And so the fact that we can now also integrate FileMaker into that process really helps, because in places where we do manage the whole stack for a client, it's great that it can all run on Ubuntu now, and also that we can completely automate all of it in the same way as we automate everything else. One client that I have where we are using it, we used it to set up the FileMaker server originally, but it's mostly those ancillary tasks that are really helpful. We work a lot with data separation. So for a web application, we will always have an interface file that is specific for that web application. And so a copy of that goes into the code base whenever a deployment is done. So basically, when an updated version of a web application is being deployed, we need to ensure that the interface file that's on the production server matches the code base. And so basically, we're using the FMS Admin command to deal with that, because we can use Ansible to deploy the code base or the code base onto the web server, and then to deploy the interface file onto the FileMaker server, close the one that's there, replace it with the new one, reopen it automatically. And that happens as part of that deployment process, so that there's no way that these things can get out of sync with each other because it's completely automated. So yeah, that's kind of one of the real benefits to us, is that it just lets us manage FileMaker Server in the same way as we do everything else. It's also cheaper for clients because you can run FileMaker Server on a lower spec machine because you don't have the overheads of Windows to deal with.
Is this a tool that you kind of just have as part of your regular deployment process when you're working with new clients, or do you only use this on select clients? And when you do have it deployed, what is the most common use case you have for those clients?
Okay, I'll try and remember all of those. We use it everywhere. These days, nothing is done manually on servers. Everything is done with playbooks that perform the necessary tasks. Because we do that, it's relatively quick for us to deploy or to create the necessary playbooks for new clients, because a lot of things in Ansible are based on roles. And so in this playbook, you can see that there is only one role, which is the FMS role. But we can take that role and we can use it in a different playbook for a different client. And then we have a whole lot of other roles that we've developed over time for application server deployment, for database server deployment, where we're using Postgres, or for installing RabbitMQ when we want a queuing system as part of the application. A lot of times with staging servers, we'll have get post receive hooks that will automatically run an Ansible playbook, which will deploy the committed code onto a staging environment. And that's basically just the difference in the call that we make to say which server we want to deploy to. A lot of that is done using another tool called Jenkins. And Jenkins is basically a continuous integration, continuous development tool that's intended for that sort of thing. So here is a very quick deployment that was being done. This is the last task that I ran to deploy a client's API. And basically, you can see that what Jenkins did was it ran this Ansible playbook. Here is the specification for what it should do. And it went through and it did a range of things on that server. And this particular task actually started automatically as the result of, no, that one didn't. That was started by administrator. But some of them can be started by those get post commit hooks. And that can include FileMaker Server interaction, or simply web application as required. The other thing that I like about Jenkins, just while we've got it open, is that basically it has a really rich permissions model. And so basically I can give clients access to run their own deployments, because I can give them credentials which only allows them to do a single thing. And then when they're in there, they basically, that's all they can do, but they can deploy their own updates. When they've finished testing, for example, they can say, hey, this is ready to go. They can log in, they can click a button, and basically it will deploy onto their application server.
So Steve, some of what you've shown, I think this is right, but I'm not sure. Some of it reminds me a little bit of Docker, and I'm not an expert at that, but is this, it's not exactly like it, but is it a little bit like Docker, or are they two totally different things?
They're two totally different things, really, because Docker is a containerization tool. So basically, in a similar sort of vein, you use code to define the state that the server will be in. But no, it's quite a different approach. because basically it is containerization rather than basically an actual server, as it were. I have had FileMaker Server running in a container.
Is there a price for an Ansible?
Yes, there is. It's the most attractive price possible. It's free. It's open source software, and basically you can use it, extend it, do as you wish with.
I signed up for it already, and I'm checking it out. I just didn't know if there's a price or.
No, and probably if you might get started with working with FileMaker Server with it, then, as I said, this is the playbook that I was using today, and it gives you a pretty good rundown on what needs to happen. This needs updating slightly because this was written before Claris had officially released the Ubuntu version. So I will do that.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay.
All right. Well, that sounds like it. This was a really fantastic presentation. I think, Ansible is something that maybe we'll all consider for our future deployments, particularly as everyone starts shifting more towards Linux deployments versus Windows deployments. Because there are some other features that you get with Linux besides the lower cost, but there's also the OData interface, the API for that, and I think Ubuntu deployments of FileMaker Server are going to become increasingly popular over the next couple of years.
Very much so. We just need to get everyone off the FML, the XML and PHP APIs, because they don't exist on the Ubuntu version. But that's no bad thing. It's a good motivation for clients who maybe are a bit stuck in the past that they need to move on.
Yep. Okay. Well, I guess that's it. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Steve. Awesome.
If anyone has some suggestions about topics that they'd like to hear about at future meetings, please let me know. My email is david@bluefeathergroup.com. If you also have, Russell, I'm going to mute you a little bit. Thanks. If you have anything that you'd like to share or present, something interesting that you've done, an interesting project that you've worked on, maybe that has a unique implementation of some feature, we like seeing that sort of thing as well. But yeah, we're always looking for meeting ideas and presenters. So if you or anyone you know is either of those things or has either of those things, please contact me. And I think that is about it.
Have a great night, guys.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
See you tomorrow when you get here.
Yep.